The sound of shattering glass pierced the peaceful morning air of Ely, Nevada, sending Sarah Ainsworth's heart racing as she clutched the wooden countertop of her small kitchen. It was the third time this week that her husband Frank had come home in a drunken rage, and she feared it wouldn't be the last. The year was 1878, and life in the mining town was unforgiving for a woman with few options and a husband spiraling into alcoholism. Sarah wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and turned to face the inevitable confrontation. At 26, her once youthful face had begun to show the strain of her difficult marriage. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes, once bright with hope, now reflected a weary resignation. "Where's the money from the eggs?" Frank demanded, his words slurring as he stumbled across the threshold. His face was flushed, his clothes disheveled from a night of drinking at the Silver Dollar Saloon. "I used it to buy flour and sugar," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We need to eat, Frank." "What I need is a drink," he growled, advancing toward her. His bloodshot eyes scanned the small cabin until they landed on the cedar chest in the corner, the one containing Sarah's most precious belongings. "That chest of yours must be worth something." Sarah's blood ran cold. "No, Frank, those are my mother's things, all I have left of her." Frank ignored her pleas, staggering toward the chest. "Times are hard, Sarah. The mine's cutting wages again. A man's got to have some comfort." "Please," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Anything but that." But Frank's mind was made up. With surprising strength for a man so intoxicated, he hoisted the cedar chest and headed for the door. "I'll be back when I'm good and ready." Sarah stood frozen as the door slammed behind him. The chest contained her mother's silver hand mirror, the family Bible with generations of births and deaths recorded inside, her grandmother's wedding quilt, and the gold locket containing a lock of her mother's hair. These weren't just possessions. They were her heritage, her connection to a past that had given her strength through the hardest times. She sank to the floor, allowing herself a moment of despair before wiping her tears away. This had gone too far. Something would have to change. Little did Sarah know that change was about to ride into town on a dusty Palomino horse. Quincy Zane adjusted his worn leather hat as he guided his horse down Ely's Main Street. At 32, he had spent the better part of his adult life wandering the Western Territories, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, and occasionally taking jobs as a scout or tracker. His tall frame and broad shoulders spoke of a life of physical labor, while the quiet watchfulness in his hazel eyes revealed a man who observed more than he spoke. The town of Ely had grown since he'd last passed through 3 years ago. The Nevada mining boom had brought prosperity to some and desperation to others. New buildings lined the once sparse Main Street, and the sound of construction competed with the piano music drifting from the saloon. Quincy dismounted in front of the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post. He needed supplies before heading north to take a job with a cattle outfit in Idaho. As he stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, a commotion across the street caught his attention. A man was arguing loudly with Silas Brenner, the owner of the town's pawn shop. Between them sat a cedar chest, beautifully crafted but showing signs of age. "It's worth twice what you're offering," the man shouted, swaying slightly on his feet despite the early hour. Silas shook his head. "The chest itself is worth something, Frank, but what am I supposed to do with old quilts and family knickknacks? Take it or leave it." "Fine," the man Frank spat, "but throw in a bottle of your good whiskey." Quincy watched the transaction with a frown. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The chest looked like a family heirloom, not something a man would willingly part with unless desperate or unless it wasn't his to sell. After collecting his money and a bottle of whiskey, Frank stumbled away toward the saloon. Quincy entered the pawn shop, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. "Help you, stranger?" Silas asked, looking up from where he was examining the contents of the chest. Quincy nodded toward the chest. Couldn't help but notice that transaction. Man seemed awful eager to trade family treasures for whiskey, Silas snorted. Frank Ainsworth's been trading everything but his soul for whiskey lately. Poor Sarah's probably down to the clothes on her back by now. "Sarah?" Quincy asked, moving closer to look at the items being removed from the chest. "His wife. Decent woman. Works at the bakery down the street. Don't know why she stays with him, except there ain't many options for a woman alone in these parts." Silas held up a silver hand mirror. "Shame about these things. They're more sentimental than valuable, but they clearly meant something to someone." Quincy examined the contents of the chest. A well-worn Bible with faded gold lettering, a handmade quilt with intricate stitching, a locket, and various small keepsakes that told the story of a family's history. "How much?" Quincy asked suddenly. Silas looked up in surprise. "For what?" "All of it, the chest and everything in it. You collecting ladies' trinkets now," Silas chuckled. "I gave Frank $15 and a bottle of whiskey." Quincy reached into his pocket and counted out $25. "Will this cover it?" Silas's eyebrows shot up. "More than cover it." "But what's your interest?" Quincy wasn't entirely sure himself. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother crying when his father had sold her prized china to pay gambling debts. Or maybe it was simply that he'd seen too much of men like Frank Ainsworth, men who took without thought of what they destroyed in the process. "Let's just say I don't like seeing family treasures used to buy whiskey," he said finally. "Where can I find Mrs. Ainsworth?" "The bakery on Pine Street." "But tread carefully, stranger. Frank's got a temper, especially when he's drinking." Quincy nodded his thanks and gathered the chest and its contents. He had planned to be on the trail to Idaho by nightfall, but something told him his journey would be delayed. Sarah kneaded the bread dough with more force than necessary, working out her frustration in the rhythmic motion. The bakery was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull, the morning rush long past, and the dinner crowd yet to arrive. The owner, Mrs. Hanson, had gone to deliver special orders, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. The bell above the door jingled, and Sarah looked up, automatically wiping her hands on her apron as she prepared to greet a customer. The words died on her lips as she saw the tall stranger carrying her mother's cedar chest. "Mrs. Ainsworth?" he asked, his voice deep and gentle. Sarah nodded, unable to speak as she stared at the chest she had thought lost forever. "My name is Quincy Zane," he said, setting the chest carefully on the counter between them. "I believe this belongs to you." Sarah reached out a trembling hand to touch the familiar wood. "How?" she whispered. "I was at Brenner's when your husband sold it," Quincy explained. "Seemed to me these things should find their way home." Sarah opened the chest with shaking hands, relief washing over her as she saw that everything was still there: the Bible, the quilt, her mother's mirror and locket. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't understand why you would do this for a stranger, but I'm grateful beyond words." Quincy shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her gratitude. "No need for thanks. I just did what seemed right." "Please let me repay you somehow," Sarah insisted. "I don't have much money, but—" "No payment necessary," Quincy interrupted. "Just keep these safe." He turned to leave, his errand completed. "Wait," Sarah called, making him pause at the door. "At least let me offer you a meal. I'll be finished here in an hour and my cottage isn't far. It's the least I can do." Quincy hesitated, aware that he should be on his way north, but there was something in Sarah's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and lingering sadness, that made him nod. "I'd appreciate that, madam." "Sarah," she corrected him with a small smile. "After what you've done, I think we can dispense with formalities." As Quincy stepped back onto the street, he told himself he was merely accepting the hospitality offered to any traveler. It had nothing to do with the way Sarah's smile had momentarily transformed her face, revealing a glimpse of the vibrant woman beneath the weariness. He would share a meal, ensure she and her belongings were safe from her husband's drinking habits, and be on his way. Idaho and the cattle job would still be there tomorrow. Sarah's cottage was modest but meticulously kept. Located on the outskirts of Ely, it stood apart from neighboring homes, surrounded by a small garden where hardy vegetables defied the harsh Nevada climate. Inside, every surface gleamed from regular cleaning, and the few pieces of furniture were arranged to make the most of the limited space. As Sarah prepared their meal, Quincy sat at the small kitchen table, feeling oddly comfortable in the domestic setting despite his years of solitary wandering. The cedar chest had been returned to its place of honor in the corner of the main room. "So you're a cowboy?" Sarah asked, placing a plate of rabbit stew in front of him. Quincy nodded. "For the most part, I've worked cattle drives, done some scouting, even tried my hand at mining once." "Didn't take to it. What brings you to Ely?" she asked, sitting across from him with her own plate. "Just passing through. I've got a job waiting with a cattle outfit near Boise." Sarah nodded, understanding the transient nature of work in the West. "We don't get many strangers who stay long. The mines bring men in, but the work is hard, and many move on when they hear of better prospects elsewhere." "Like your husband?" Quincy asked before he could think better of it. Sarah's expression closed slightly. "Frank worked in the mines when we first came here 3 years ago. Then there was an accident. He survived, but 2 of his friends didn't. He hasn't been the same since." Quincy could hear what she wasn't saying, that the drink had become Frank's way of dealing with the memories. He'd seen it happen to good men before. "That's a hard thing," he acknowledged. They ate in silence for a moment before Sarah spoke again. "I still don't understand why you bought back my things. It must have cost you." Quincy shrugged. "I had the money, and like I said, it seemed like the right thing to do." "Most men wouldn't have bothered," Sarah said softly. "I'm not most men," Quincy replied, then felt foolish for the boast. "What I mean is, I know what you mean," Sarah interrupted with a gentle smile, "and I'm grateful for it." The simple meal stretched into an hour of conversation. Quincy found himself telling Sarah about his travels across the Western Territories, about the cattle drives from Texas and the mountains of Montana. In turn, she spoke of growing up in Ohio, of her parents' deaths from influenza when she was 20, and of meeting Frank when he passed through her hometown with tales of silver fortunes to be made in Nevada. "He was different then," she said, her eyes distant with memory. "Charming, full of dreams. He promised me a life of adventure." "And instead you got Ely," Quincy observed. Sarah laughed, a sound that transformed her face and made her look years younger. "Yes, instead I got Ely, but I've made a life here. I have my job at the bakery, my garden. It's not what I dreamed of as a girl, but it's mine." The sound of heavy footsteps on the porch interrupted their conversation. The door swung open and Frank Ainsworth staggered in, reeking of whiskey and sweat. "Who the hell is this?" he demanded, glaring at Quincy. Sarah rose quickly. "This is Mr. Zane. He's passing through town and you invited him to dinner." Frank's voice rose dangerously. "Entertaining men while I'm out working." "You haven't worked in months, Frank," Sarah said, a rare edge to her voice. "And Mr. Zane returned the family heirlooms you sold for whiskey this morning." Frank's bloodshot eyes darted to the cedar chest and back to Quincy. "So you're interfering in my business, are you?" Quincy stood slowly, aware that sudden movements might provoke the drunk man. "No interference intended, just returning something precious to its rightful owner." "Everything in this house is mine," Frank snarled. "Including her." Quincy's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I think I'll be on my way, Mrs. Ainsworth. Thank you for the meal." "Yes, get out," Frank spat. "And don't come back if you know what's good for you." Quincy moved toward the door, pausing beside Sarah. "You sure you'll be all right?" he asked quietly. Before she could answer, Frank lunged forward, shoving Quincy toward the door. "I said get out." Quincy caught himself before he could stumble, years of barroom brawls having honed his reflexes. It would be easy to knock Frank down. The man could barely stand as it was, but that would only make things worse for Sarah once he left. "Good night, Mrs. Ainsworth," he said formally, tipping his hat before stepping outside. As he walked away from the cottage, Quincy heard the raised voices inside turn to shouting, then an ominous silence. He hesitated, torn between respecting Sarah's privacy and ensuring her safety. Before he could decide, the door opened and Frank stormed out, heading in the direction of town and presumably the saloon. Quincy waited in the shadows until he was sure Frank was gone, then approached the cottage again. He knocked softly on the door. "Sarah, it's Quincy. Are you all right?" The door opened slowly to reveal Sarah, one hand pressed to her cheek where a red mark was beginning to form. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady despite the evidence to the contrary. "He's gone back to the saloon. He won't return until morning." Anger flared in Quincy's chest. "He hit you." "It's not the first time," Sarah admitted, "but I'm all right, truly." Quincy's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You can't stay here with him." "Where would I go?" Sarah asked simply. "This is my home, my life is here." "A life where your husband sells your belongings for whiskey and uses his fists when you speak up," Quincy challenged. "You deserve better than that, Sarah." She gave him a sad smile. "Perhaps, but we don't always get what we deserve in this life, do we?" "Thank you again for your kindness today, Mr. Zane. I wish you safe travels to Idaho." The dismissal was gentle but firm. Quincy knew he had no right to interfere further in her life. He was a stranger passing through, and tomorrow he would be gone. Yet as he made his way back to the small room he'd rented at the boarding house, Sarah's face and the mark on her cheek stayed with him. Morning found Quincy at the stable, saddling his palomino for the journey north. The sky was clear, promising good traveling weather, and he had restocked his supplies at the general store. There was no reason to delay his departure any longer. He led his horse out into the morning sun, prepared to leave Ely and its troubles behind. But as he mounted up, his gaze fell on the bakery where Sarah would be working, and he found himself unable to ride away without assuring himself of her welfare one last time. The bakery was busy with the morning crowd when Quincy entered. Sarah moved efficiently behind the counter, serving customers with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A high collar on her dress concealed what Quincy suspected was a bruise from the previous night's encounter. She looked up as the bell announced his arrival, and for a moment their eyes met across the crowded shop. Recognition, gratitude, and something else, regret, perhaps flickered across her face before she returned her attention to the customer she was serving. Quincy waited patiently until the rush subsided and Sarah was able to approach him. "I thought you'd be on the trail by now," she said. "Heading out shortly," he confirmed. "Just wanted to say goodbye properly." Sarah nodded, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "That's kind of you. I hope your journey is safe." There was so much more Quincy wanted to say. He wanted to tell her to leave Frank, to start fresh somewhere else, to believe she deserved happiness. But those weren't his words to say to a woman he barely knew, no matter how strongly he felt the injustice of her situation. "If you ever need anything," he said instead, "I'll be working at the Circle K ranch near Boise for the next few months." Sarah's smile was genuine this time if tinged with sadness. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Zane, but I'll be fine." The bell jingled as new customers entered the bakery. "I should get back to work," Sarah said, taking a step back. Quincy nodded. "Goodbye, Sarah." "Goodbye, Quincy. And thank you again." He left the bakery feeling unsettled. The Idaho job was a good opportunity, and he had given his word that he would be there. Yet leaving Sarah in her current situation went against every instinct he had. Lost in thought, Quincy nearly collided with Silas Brenner outside the pawnshop. "Still in town, I see," the older man observed. "Thought you'd be long gone by now." "Just leaving," Quincy replied. Silas studied him for a moment. "That was a decent thing you did, buying back Sarah's things." "Wish more folks would stand up to Frank. He wasn't always this way, you know. Used to be a hard worker before the mine accident. Lost 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 good friends in the cave-in." Quincy nodded. Sarah had mentioned the accident. "Doesn't give him the right to treat his wife the way he does." "No, it doesn't," Silas agreed. "But in a town this size, folks tend to mind their own business. Sheriff's no help he and Frank were friends before the drink took hold." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Word around town is that Frank's got himself in debt to some unsavory characters. Been borrowing to support his habit." "What kind of unsavory characters?" Quincy asked, suddenly alert. "Men who don't take kindly to late payments," Silas replied grimly. "Men who might decide to take what they are owed in other ways if Frank can't pay up." The implication was clear, and it made Quincy's blood run cold. "Does Sarah know?" Silas shook his head. "Doubt it. Frank wouldn't want her knowing how deep he's in." "But folks talk, and I thought you should know before you ride out." Quincy thanked the pawnbroker for the information and walked slowly back to where his horse waited patiently. The Idaho job was a good opportunity, but it would still be there in a week or two. Some things were more important than a paycheck. Decision made, Quincy led his horse toward the livery stable. He would stay in Ely a while longer, just until he was sure Sarah was safe. The Silver Dollar Saloon was crowded despite the early afternoon hour. Miners coming off shift mingled with cowboys passing through town, and the usual assortment of gamblers and drifters. Quincy nursed a whiskey at the bar, keeping his attention on a corner table where Frank Ainsworth was engaged in a heated conversation with 2 men Quincy didn't recognize. He had spent the last 3 days observing Frank's movements, learning his routines. The man spent most of his waking hours at the saloon, occasionally doing odd jobs around town when he needed money for the next bottle. What was most concerning were his meetings with the 2 men Quincy was now watching, well-dressed gamblers who didn't fit the usual Ely crowd. "Another?" the bartender asked, gesturing to Quincy's empty glass. "Just water," Quincy replied, not wanting to dull his senses. "Those men with Ainsworth, they regulars?" The bartender glanced over, then lowered his voice. "Came in about a month ago. Run games at the tables in back. Word is they're connected to a gambling outfit in Virginia City. Not men you want to cross." Quincy nodded his thanks for both the information and the water. Across the room, Frank's voice was rising, though the words were indistinct over the general noise of the saloon. One of the gamblers reached out and grabbed Frank's wrist, saying something that made the color drain from Frank's face. After a few more minutes of conversation, Frank stood unsteadily and headed for the door. The gamblers watched him go, their expressions grim. Quincy waited until Frank had a head start before following him out onto the street. The afternoon sun was blinding after the dim interior of the saloon, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. When they did, He spotted Frank heading not toward the cottage on the outskirts of town, but toward the bakery. A sense of foreboding settled in Quincy's stomach as he followed at a distance. Nothing good could come of Frank confronting Sarah at her workplace, especially in his current state. The bakery was quiet when Frank burst in, only a few customers lingering over coffee and pastries. Quincy entered just in time to hear Frank demanding money from Sarah. "I know you've been holding out on me," Frank accused, his words slurring. "Where's the money from your wages?" Sarah stood her ground behind the counter, her face pale but composed. "I used it to pay the rent, Frank." "You know that." "You're lying," Frank hissed, reaching across the counter to grab her arm. "Those men are going to break my fingers if I don't pay them by tomorrow." "Let go of her," Quincy said, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Frank whirled around, nearly losing his balance. "You again. I told you to stay away from my wife. And I'm telling you to take your hands off her," Quincy replied evenly. The few remaining customers were watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Mrs. Hanson, the bakery owner, had emerged from the back room, alerted by the commotion. "Frank Ainsworth, you get out of my establishment right now," the older woman demanded. "I won't have you harassing my employees." Frank released Sarah's arm, but his anger had found a new target in Quincy. "This isn't over," he threatened, jabbing a finger in Quincy's direction. "You stay away from what's mine." As Frank stumbled out of the bakery, Mrs. Hanson turned to Sarah with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" Sarah nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. "I'm fine. I'm sorry for the disturbance." "Not your fault, Mrs. Hanson assured her before turning to Quincy. "Thank you for intervening, sir." Quincy acknowledged her thanks with a nod, but his focus remained on Sarah. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Sarah glanced at Mrs. Hanson, who waved her off. "Go on. We're slow this afternoon anyway." They stepped outside, moving away from the bakery windows to a quiet spot beside the building. Sarah hugged herself despite the warm afternoon, as if trying to hold herself together. "How long has he been borrowing from those gamblers?" Quincy asked. Sarah looked surprised. "You know about that?" "I've been watching. Those men aren't the type to accept excuses for unpaid debts." "I don't know exactly how much he owes," Sarah admitted. "He started borrowing a few weeks ago, said he had a sure thing, a mining claim that was going to pay off big." She sighed. "There was no claim, of course. Just more drinking and gambling." "You need to get somewhere safe," Quincy said. "When men like that don't get their money, they look for other ways to collect, and Frank's made it clear he considers you his property." Fear flickered across Sarah's face, quickly replaced by resignation. "Where would I go? I have no family, no savings." "I have a friend who owns a small ranch about 50 miles north of here," Quincy offered. "Rose Carson. She's a widow who runs the place on her own. She could use the help, and it would get you away from Ely until this blows over." Sarah hesitated. "Just leave. Everything I've worked for is here." "What's here that's worth your safety?" Quincy challenged gently. "Frank's gambling debts aren't going away, and those men won't forget." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she asked, "When would we leave?" "Tonight," Quincy replied. "After dark, pack only what you need and can carry. I'll meet you at your cottage at midnight." The decision seemed to both terrify and relieve Sarah. "All right," she agreed quietly. "Midnight." As Sarah returned to work, and Quincy headed back to his room at the boarding house, neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street, one of the gamblers who had been meeting with Frank, his cold eyes following their interaction with calculating interest. The hours until midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. Quincy spent them preparing for the journey, acquiring additional supplies and ensuring his horse was well rested. He also kept a watchful eye on the saloon, noting that Frank remained there, getting progressively more intoxicated as the evening wore on. More concerning were the movements of the two gamblers, who left the saloon shortly after sundown and didn't return. Quincy had a sinking feeling they might be planning to collect on Frank's debts sooner rather than later. By 11:30, Quincy had his horse saddled and ready at the edge of town. The night was clear, stars sprinkled across the vast Nevada sky, and a half-moon provided just enough light to travel by. He led the Palomino quietly through the back streets of Ely, avoiding the still bustling Main Street where the saloons and gambling houses would be active for hours yet. As he approached Sarah's cottage, a sense of wrongness made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The cottage was dark, as expected, but the front door stood slightly ajar. Quincy tied his horse to a nearby tree and drew the revolver from his holster, approaching the cottage with cautious steps. Inside, he found chaos. Furniture had been overturned, cupboards stood open with their contents scattered across the floor. The cedar chest he had returned to Sarah lay on its side, empty. "Sarah," Quincy called softly, moving through the small home with growing dread. There was no answer, but as he entered the bedroom, he found a note pinned to the pillow with a knife. The message was crude but clear. "Ainsworth, you owe us. We've taken your wife as collateral. Bring $200 to the old mine by dawn or you'll be a widower." Cold fury washed over Quincy. The gamblers had decided to take matters into their own hands rather than wait for Frank to pay them. And now Sarah, who had done nothing wrong except stay loyal to a man who didn't deserve her, was paying the price. Quincy knew the old mine. The note referred to an abandoned shaft about 2 miles outside of town that had played out years ago. It was a perfect place for an exchange like the one the gamblers proposed, isolated, with plenty of hiding spots and escape routes. He also knew that Frank, in his current state, was unlikely to even find the note before dawn, let alone come up with $200. Waiting for Frank to sober up and somehow produce the money wasn't an option. Sarah's safety, perhaps her life, was at stake. Returning to his horse, Quincy checked his weapons, the revolver on his hip, a rifle in its scabbard, and a knife in his boot. He had some money saved for his journey north, though not the full amount the gamblers demanded. It would have to be enough, supplemented by his skills and the element of surprise. The old mine was a dark scar in the hillside, its timber supports weathered and sagging with age. Quincy approached cautiously, leaving his horse tethered a safe distance away. A faint light flickered from within the mine entrance, a lantern, likely, and as he drew nearer, he could hear voices. "You think he'll actually show up with the money?" one voice asked. "Doesn't matter," another replied. "If he does, we get paid. If he doesn't, we take his woman with us to Virginia City. She'll fetch a good price at certain establishments." A female voice, Sarah's, spoke up, fear evident but defiance stronger. "Frank will kill you if you touch me." Harsh laughter answered her. "Your husband's passed out drunk at the saloon, lady. He probably hasn't even noticed you're gone yet." Quincy's jaw clenched at the confirmation of his fears. These men had no intention of simply releasing Sarah once their debt was paid. They saw her as a commodity, something to be traded or sold. Moving silently, Quincy circled around to get a better view of the mine entrance. In the dim light, he could make out 3 figures. Sarah, seated on a crate with her hands bound in front of her, and the 2 gamblers. One stood near the entrance, keeping watch, while the other lounged against the wall closer to Sarah. Quincy weighed his options. A direct confrontation was risky with Sarah so close to danger. He needed to separate the gamblers somehow, deal with them one at a time. Fortune favored him when the lookout stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, moving a few paces away from the mine entrance. Quincy circled through the shadows until he was behind the man, then struck quickly, bringing the butt of his revolver down on the back of the gambler's head. The man crumpled without a sound. One down, one to go. Quincy dragged the unconscious man into the brush, took his pistol, and bound his hands with his own belt. Then, adjusting his hat low over his eyes, he approached the mine entrance, trying to mimic the swagger of the man he'd just incapacitated. "Todd," the remaining gambler called out as Quincy's silhouette appeared in the entrance. "That you?" Instead of answering, Quincy stepped fully into the lantern light, his revolver trained on the second gambler. "Don't move," he ordered. The gambler's hand twitched toward his hip, but he froze when Quincy cocked his weapon. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who objects to men who kidnap women," Quincy replied evenly. "Your partner's taking a nap outside. You're going to untie Mrs. Ainsworth, and then you're both going to leave Ely and never come back." The gambler's eyes narrowed. "You the cowboy who's been sniffing around her." "This ain't your business, friend." "I'm making it my business," Quincy said, his voice hardening. "Untie her, now." For a tense moment, Quincy thought the gambler might try something foolish. But self-preservation won out, and the man slowly moved to where Sarah sat, fumbling with the ropes that bound her wrists. As soon as she was free, Sarah scrambled away from her captor, moving to stand behind Quincy. "Are you all right?" he asked her, not taking his eyes off the gambler. "Yes," she replied, her voice steadier than he expected. "Here's how this is going to work," Quincy told the gambler. "Whatever Frank Ainsworth owes you, consider it paid." He tossed a small pouch of coins onto the ground. "That's $100. Take it and consider yourselves lucky you're walking away at all." The gambler looked at the money, then back at Quincy with calculated assessment in his eyes. 200 was the agreed amount. "The agreed amount was with Frank," Quincy countered. "This is a new agreement, with me. Take it or leave it." After a tense standoff, the gambler snatched up the pouch. "Fine, but Ainsworth still owes us the difference." "That's between you and him," Quincy said. "But Mrs. Ainsworth is no longer part of the equation." "Understood," the gambler nodded grudgingly. "Now get your partner and get out of my sight," Quincy ordered. "If I see either of you in Ely again, our next conversation won't be so civilized." Once the gambler had exited the mine, Quincy finally turned to Sarah. In the lantern light, he could see a bruise forming on her cheek where she'd clearly been struck, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Thank you," she said simply. "How did you know they'd taken me?" "I was coming to meet you as planned," Quincy explained. "Found your house ransacked and their note." He touched her bruised cheek gently. "Did they hurt you badly?" Sarah shook her head. "Just this: when I fought back during the kidnapping, I'm all right." The sound of horses moving away from the mine told them the gamblers had taken Quincy's warning to heart and were leaving. Still, Quincy kept his revolver ready as he guided Sarah outside, retrieving the lantern to light their way. "My offer still stands," he told her as they walked toward where he'd left his horse. "My friend's ranch is a good place to start fresh. Frank will be looking for you once he sobers up, especially when those gamblers tell him I paid part of his debt." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering. "All my life," she said finally, "I've done what was expected of me. I stayed with Frank out of duty, even when the man I married disappeared into the bottle. I told myself it was the right thing, the honorable thing." She looked up at Quincy, moonlight silvering her features. "But there's no honor in staying where you're not valued, where you're treated as property to be sold for whiskey money." "No, there isn't," Quincy agreed softly. "If your friend truly needs help, I'd be grateful for the opportunity," Sarah said, her decision made. They reached Quincy's horse, and he helped her mount before swinging up behind her. As they rode away from the mine and the dark chapter of Sarah's life it represented, Quincy felt her gradually relax against him, the tension of the ordeal slowly leaving her body. They stopped briefly at Sarah's cottage to collect the few belongings the gamblers hadn't destroyed or stolen. The cedar chest was empty but intact, and Sarah insisted on bringing it. "It was my mother's," she explained, "and now it can hold new memories." By the time they left Ely behind, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, painting the desert in gold and rose. Sarah looked back only once at the town that had been her home for 3 years. "Do you regret leaving?" Quincy asked, noting her backward glance. Sarah shook her head. "No. I'm just saying goodbye to the woman I was. She did the best she could with what she had." "And the woman you are now?" Quincy asked. Sarah turned her face forward toward the open country ahead. "She's ready for a new beginning." Rose Carson's ranch was exactly as Quincy had described it, small but well-maintained, with a modest herd of cattle, some chickens, and a vegetable garden that was clearly the pride of its owner. The main house was a sturdy log structure with a wide porch, smoke curling invitingly from the stone chimney. As they approached, a woman emerged from the barn, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Rose Carson was in her 50s, her dark hair streaked with gray and her face weathered from years of outdoor work, but her smile was warm as she recognized Quincy. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she called, wiping her hands on her trousers as she walked to meet them. "Quincy Zane, it's been at least 2 years." "Closer to 3, Rose," Quincy replied, dismounting and helping Sarah down. "How's the ranch still standing?" Rose said with pride. Her keen eyes took in Sarah's bruised face and tired posture, and her expression softened. "And who's this you've brought me?" "This is Sarah Ainsworth," Quincy introduced. "She needs a fresh start, and I remembered you saying you could use help around the place." Rose nodded, understanding more than Quincy had said. "Well, you've come to the right place, Sarah. I've got more work than hands, and it gets lonely out here with just the cows for company." She gestured toward the house. "Come on in. You both look like you could use a hot meal and rest." Over dinner, Quincy explained the situation to Rose, who listened without judgment. Sarah added her own perspective at times, gradually opening up about her life with Frank and her decision to leave. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like," Rose told Sarah when the story was finished. "I can't pay much, but you'll have room and board and a safe place to build whatever future you want." "Thank you," Sarah said sincerely. "I'm a hard worker and I learn quickly." "I don't doubt it," Rose replied with a smile. "Anyone who's survived what you have has grit to spare." Later, after Rose had shown Sarah to the small guest room and retired for the night, Quincy sat on the porch steps, enjoying the peaceful night sounds of the ranch. The door opened behind him and Sarah emerged, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. "May I join you?" she asked. Quincy nodded, making room for her on the step. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky. "Will you stay?" Sarah asked finally. At least for a little while, Quincy had been asking himself the same question. The Idaho job was still waiting, but something stronger than professional obligation held him here. "For a while," he agreed. "I know some people in these parts. I can spread the word that you're under my protection in case Frank or those gamblers get any ideas about following you." Sarah smiled. "My protector? You've been that since the moment you saw Frank selling my belongings." "You'd have found your own way eventually," Quincy said. "You're stronger than you know." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged, "but it helps to have someone believe in that strength before you can see it yourself." Their eyes met in the starlight, and Quincy was struck by how different Sarah looked already, as if leaving behind her old life had lifted a weight from her shoulders, allowing her true self to emerge. "We should get some rest," he said, reluctant to break the moment but aware of how exhausted they both must be after their ordeal and journey. "Morning comes early on a ranch," Sarah nodded and stood. "Good night, Quincy, and thank you for everything." As she disappeared into the house, Quincy remained on the porch, contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had planned to be in Idaho by now, starting a new job with new people. Instead, he was here, drawn into Sarah's life in a way he hadn't anticipated. For a man who had spent years drifting from place to place, the feeling of being needed, of having a purpose beyond the next paycheck, was both foreign and strangely satisfying. The days at Rose's ranch settled into a rhythm. Sarah proved to be as adaptable and hardworking as she had promised, quickly learning the routines of ranch life. She helped with the chickens and the vegetable garden, learned to milk the cow, and even began to assist with the cattle when extra hands were needed. Quincy stayed on, telling himself it was only until he was sure Sarah was settled and safe. He repaired fences, helped with the small herd, and made improvements to the barn and outbuildings that Rose had been unable to manage alone. In the evenings, the three of them would share meals and conversation, creating a sense of belonging that Quincy hadn't experienced in years. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah bloomed like a flower finally receiving the sun and water it needed. The bruises faded from her face, and her smile came more readily. She began to speak of future plans, expanding the garden, perhaps adding some fruit trees, learning to ride better so she could help more with the cattle. Quincy found himself drawn to this new Sarah, the woman emerging from the shadow of her past. Her quiet strength and resilience impressed him, as did her capacity for joy despite all she had endured. One evening, about a month after their arrival at the ranch, Quincy and Sarah rode out to check on a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. The summer sun was beginning its descent, painting the landscape in warm gold tones. "Rose says you were supposed to be in Idaho by now," Sarah commented as they worked side by side, mending the broken fence rails. "A cattle job," Quincy nodded. "The foreman's an old friend. He'll have found someone else by now." "You didn't have to stay," Sarah said, glancing at him from under the brim of the hat Rose had lent her. "I'm safe here. Rose has been teaching me to shoot, and no one from Ely has come looking." "Do you want me to go?" Quincy asked directly. Sarah looked away, focusing on the fence rail she was securing. "No," she admitted quietly, "but I don't want to be the reason you give up opportunities." Quincy considered her words as they finished the repair in companionable silence. The truth was, he had stayed for Sarah, but not just out of a sense of protection or obligation. Something deeper had taken root during their time together, a connection he hadn't been looking for, but now couldn't imagine walking away from. "There will be other jobs," he said finally as they mounted their horses for the ride back. "Right now, this is where I want to be." The smile Sarah gave him in response was worth more than any wages Idaho could have offered. As summer turned to fall, life at the ranch continued to flourish. Rose's small herd produced a good crop of calves. The garden yielded a bountiful harvest, and with Quincy's help, several long-standing repairs and improvements to the property were completed. More significant than these physical changes, however, was the deepening relationship between Quincy and Sarah. What had begun as a chance encounter in a pawn shop had grown into a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. They never spoke directly of feelings, both still cautious after their respective pasts, Sarah with her failed marriage, Quincy with years of solitary wandering. But their actions spoke what words did not. The way Quincy's eyes sought Sarah whenever she entered a room, the way Sarah's hand would linger when passing him tools or dishes, the long conversations that stretched into the night when Rose had retired. Rose observed the developing bond with quiet approval. "You two remind me of how my late husband and I started," she told Sarah one day as they preserved vegetables from the garden. "He stopped by our farm looking for work, intending to stay a week. Ended up staying 40 years. Sarah blushed but didn't deny the comparison. "Quincy has his own life, his own path. I can't expect him to change that for me." "Paths change," Rose said simply. "Sometimes for the better." In late October, Quincy rode into the nearest town for supplies and to check for any mail at the general store. Among the letters waiting was one addressed to him in an unfamiliar hand. Opening it, he discovered it was from the sheriff of Ely. The letter was brief but sobering. Frank Ainsworth had died 3 weeks earlier, found frozen to death in an alley behind the saloon after a night of heavy drinking. The sheriff, knowing of Quincy's connection to Sarah, thought she should be informed. There was no family to claim Frank's few remaining possessions, which had been sold to cover burial costs. Quincy rode back to the ranch slowly, considering how to share this news with Sarah. Frank had been a poor husband and a troubled man, but he had been a part of her life for years. His death marked the definitive end of that chapter. He found Sarah in the garden, harvesting the last of the root vegetables before the first hard frost. She looked up at his approach, her smile fading as she read his expression. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her basket and wiping her hands on her apron. Quincy handed her the letter without preamble. "From the sheriff in Ely." Sarah read it quickly, her face betraying little emotion. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "Are you all right?" Quincy asked gently. Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes and no, it's strange. I mourned Frank years ago, the man he was when we married, the future we might have had, the man he became." She trailed off, looking out across the ranch to the distant mountains. "I'm sorry he died alone and cold. No one deserves that." Her compassion, even for the man who had mistreated her, was one of the qualities Quincy had come to admire most about Sarah. She had every right to be bitter, yet she chose empathy instead. "The sheriff mentions there's no family," Sarah continued. "I should go back, see to his grave properly." "I'll go with you," Quincy offered immediately. Sarah looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you, but not yet. Let the first snow fall and melt. By then I'll be ready." They stood together in the garden as the afternoon light waned, neither speaking but drawing comfort from the other's presence. Frank's death had removed the last legal tie binding Sarah to her past life. She was truly free now to build a new life, to make her own choices. Including, perhaps, the choice to love again. Winter came to Nevada with a vengeance, blanketing the ranch in snow and keeping them occupied with the constant work of caring for animals and maintaining the homestead in harsh conditions. The promised trip to Ely was delayed by impassable roads, but Sarah seemed content to wait. She had made peace with Frank's death in her own way. The long winter evenings were spent in the warmth of Rose's parlor, the three of them gathered around the fireplace. Rose taught Sarah to knit, and Quincy entertained them with stories from his travels. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged simple gifts: a new hat Rose had knitted for Quincy, a carved wooden box Quincy had made for Sarah, a set of hair combs Sarah had ordered from a catalog for Rose. As Rose retired for the night, leaving Quincy and Sarah alone by the fire, a comfortable silence settled between them. Sarah's fingers traced the intricate carving on the wooden box, a pattern of wild roses that had taken Quincy weeks to complete. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I'll keep my mother's locket in it." "I'm glad you like it," Quincy replied, watching the firelight play across her features. In the months since leaving Ely, Sarah had changed in subtle but significant ways. The constant tension she had carried in her shoulders had eased, and her eyes had lost the wary look of someone anticipating the next blow. She laughed more freely, spoke her mind without hesitation, and moved through the world with growing confidence. "I have something else for you," Quincy said, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Sarah unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver ring set with a small turquoise stone. "It's lovely," she breathed, examining the simple but elegant piece. "It belonged to my grandmother," Quincy explained. "She gave it to me before she died, said I should give it to someone special one day." He paused, gathering his courage. "I'm not asking for promises, Sarah. I know it's too soon and you're still finding your way, but I wanted you to have it as a symbol that you matter to me, that what we've found here is important." Sarah looked up from the ring, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've been afraid to hope," she admitted. "Afraid that you'd wake up one morning and remember you have a whole world waiting for you beyond this ranch. That staying in one place with one person might start to feel like a cage to a man used to roaming free." "Not a cage," Quincy said, taking her hand in his. "An anchor. Something I didn't know I was missing until I found you." Sarah's fingers closed around the ring. "I can't wear it yet," she said honestly, "but I'll keep it. And when I'm ready, when we're both ready, I'll put it on." Quincy nodded, understanding and respecting her need for time. They had both come to this place carrying the weight of their pasts. Building something new required patience and care. "In the spring," Sarah continued, "after we visit Ely, perhaps we could look for a place of our own. Not far from Rose. I wouldn't want to leave her entirely, but somewhere we could build something that's just ours." "I'd like that," Quincy agreed, hope warming him more thoroughly than the fire before them. As promised, they made the journey to Ely when the spring thaw rendered the roads passable again. The town had changed little in the months since their departure, though there were a few new faces and businesses along the main street. They visited Frank's grave first, a simple marker in the small cemetery on the edge of town. Sarah placed wildflowers she had gathered on the journey, said a quiet prayer, and then turned away without tears. It was the act of a woman paying respects to someone who had once been important in her life, but whose power to hurt her was long past. Their next stop was the bakery, where Mrs. Hanson greeted Sarah with genuine delight. "Look at you," she exclaimed, taking in Sarah's healthy appearance and confident bearing. "Life away from here has certainly agreed with you." "It has," Sarah agreed, introducing Quincy properly. "Mrs. Hanson was kind to me when kindness was in short supply," she explained to him. "Then I'm in your debt, madam," Quincy told the older woman sincerely. They spent the afternoon catching up on town news and collecting the few remaining items Sarah had left behind in her hasty departure. As evening approached, they said their goodbyes, promising to visit again someday. "I'm glad we came," Sarah said as they rode out of town, the setting sun at their backs. "I needed to see it once more to know for certain that chapter is truly closed." "And is it?" Quincy asked. Sarah nodded, her expression serene. "Yes, Ely was never really home. It was just where I lived for a while." "And the ranch," Quincy ventured. "Is that home?" Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "Not the place itself," she said finally, "but the life we're building there with Rose, with each other, that feels like home." The warmth that spread through Quincy's chest at her words had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. For a man who had spent most of his life on the move, the concept of home had always been abstract, a temporary stopping place between journeys. Sarah had changed that, offering him a reason to put down roots. They returned to the ranch to find Rose in high spirits. During their absence, she had received a letter from her nephew, who had finished his schooling back east and wanted to come west to learn ranching. "It's perfect timing," Rose told them over dinner. With Jason coming, I'll have the help I need here, which means you two can focus on finding your own place, as you've been talking about." Sarah and Quincy exchanged surprised glances. They hadn't shared those plans with Rose yet. The older woman chuckled at their expressions. "These walls aren't that thick, and my hearing is just fine. Besides, I've seen the way you look at each other. It's only natural you'd want a place of your own." A month later, they founded a small but promising piece of land about 5 miles from Rose's ranch. There was a creek running through the property, good grazing land, and a stand of timber that would provide building materials. The cabin was little more than a shack, but Quincy saw the potential immediately. "We can expand it," he explained to Sarah as they walked the property. "Add rooms as we need them. The soil near the creek is good for a garden, and there's enough pasture for a small herd to start." Sarah's eyes shone with excitement as she envisioned the possibilities. "It's perfect," she declared. "It needs work, but we can make it ours." They made an offer that day, and by early summer the land was theirs. Quincy threw himself into the work of improving the cabin, assisted by Rose's nephew Jason and several neighbors who came to help in the spirit of Western community. Sarah divided her time between Rose's ranch, where she was teaching Jason the routines she had learned, and the new homestead, where she planted a garden and made plans for the interior of their expanded home. On a warm evening in late July, with the cabin's new roof complete and the first-room addition framed, Quincy and Sarah sat on the rough-hewn bench he had built outside their door. The sunset painted the landscape in vibrant oranges and pinks, and the air was filled with the scent of sage and wildflowers. Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew the turquoise ring Quincy had given her at Christmas. "I'm ready now," she said simply, extending it to him. Quincy took the ring, his heart hammering in his chest. "Are you sure?" Sarah nodded, her smile radiant. "When you bought back my mother's belongings that day in Ely, you gave me more than just treasured keepsakes. You showed me that I mattered, that what was precious to me was worth protecting." She held out her left hand. "I don't need a preacher or papers to know that you're the man I want to build a life with, if you still want the same." Instead of words, Quincy answered by slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the turquoise stone catching the last golden rays of the setting sun. "I've wandered most of my life," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "Never staying in one place long enough to call it home. But home isn't a place, Sarah. It's a feeling. It's where you're understood and accepted for who you are." He cupped her cheek gently. "You're my home." Sarah leaned into his touch, her eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness. "And you're mine." Their kiss sealed the promises they had made, not just the formal ones of marriage, but the deeper commitments to support each other's growth, to face life's challenges together, to create something lasting from the broken pieces of their pasts. As darkness fell over their new homestead, they remained on the bench, planning their future together. They would complete the cabin expansion before winter. In the spring, they would buy cattle to start their own small herd. Perhaps, Sarah suggested shyly, they might even start thinking about children, a family to fill the rooms they were building. Quincy pulled her closer, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a simple act of decency, buying back a woman's treasured possessions from a pawn shop. He couldn't have known then how that single decision would change the course of his life, giving him a purpose and a partner he hadn't realized he was seeking. In the years that followed, the small homestead prospered under their care. The cabin grew to accommodate their expanding family, first a son, James, born in the winter of their second year on the property, and then twin daughters, Emma and Elizabeth, who arrived 2 years later to complete their family. The cattle herd increased steadily, providing a stable income supplemented by Sarah's successful vegetable garden, which produced enough excess to sell at the market in town. Rose remained a beloved part of their lives, a grandmother to their children and a trusted advisor in times of difficulty. Her ranch, now managed primarily by her nephew Jason, continued to thrive, creating a supportive extended family that enriched their lives. On the 5th anniversary of their arrival at the homestead, Quincy presented Sarah with a gift, a new cedar chest, larger and more elaborately carved than the one that had first connected them. Like the original, it contained treasures: her mother's mirror and locket, now joined by locks of their children's hair, drawings they had made, and other mementos of their life together. "For new memories," Quincy said as Sarah admired the workmanship, "and for keeping them safe." Sarah ran her hand over the smooth wood, thinking of how far they had come from that day in Ely when a desperate husband had sold her heritage for whiskey, and an honorable cowboy had bought it back. "That day in the pawn shop," she said, looking up at the man who had become her partner in all things. "When you returned my mother's things to me, did you have any idea what you were starting?" Quincy smiled, taking her hand and running his thumb over the turquoise ring she never removed. "No," he admitted. "I just knew I couldn't ride away without doing something. I never imagined it would lead me to everything I never knew I wanted." As their children's laughter echoed through the home they had built together, Sarah leaned into Quincy's embrace, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought him to that pawn shop on that particular day. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that had healed them both, proving that even in the harsh realities of the western frontier, second chances were possible, and happiness could be found in the most unexpected places. "I'm glad you decided to stay," Sarah whispered, her head resting against his shoulder. "Best decision I ever made," Quincy replied, his arms tightening around her, "though buying that cedar chest runs a close second." Their laughter mingled in the warm evening air, a testament to the joy they had found together, a joy born from compassion, nurtured by respect, and sustained by a love that had transformed them both from wounded souls into a family that would thrive for generations to come on the land they had made their own.